what I do know is that God greatly esteems women, that he has gifted everybody who loves him and trusts him with certain innate gifts and abilities. And so we want to be people who figure out how to use them and how to be faithful stewards of those gifts without minimizing them. You can walk in humility and also kill it with your gifts, you know?
Well, our guest today is Sophie Hudson. Sophie's a best-selling author, and you started out blogging, and then you started writing books, and you've got a podcast. I love the name of this podcast, by the way, The Big Boo Cast. That is fun. Well, first of all, I got to know where'd the Big Boo? Where'd that come from? That's a great name.
Okay, well, listen. So back when I started my blog, this was back in 2005, we were all sort of scared of the internet, so nobody used their real names. You know, everybody had like some kind of moniker, and so
Sure.
mine was Boo Mama, and then my friend Melanie, who lives in San Antonio, had a blog called Big Mama because that's what her little girl called her. And so we got to know each other through our blogs, and then we started to talk on the phone, which admittedly sounds a little bit like, you know, like we're on some sort of dating site, but that was not the deal at all. We just met through blogs, eventually started to talk on the phone. And when my husband would hear us talk, we always try to talk in the afternoons when our kids were taking naps. And he, at one point, just sort of offhandedly said, y'all should have a podcast the way y'all laugh together. I was like, okay, how do you do that? And so, so this was 2007. So I went to CompUSA and got a microphone, and Melanie went to Best Buy and got a microphone, just the lowest quality of all the low quality microphones. And so we decided to call it the Big Boo Cast because she was Big Mama and I was Big Mama.
I love that.
And
That's
so fun. we've been doing that little podcast for now, 17 years, which is kind of cuckoo to me, but it's been so much fun, and it's kind of turned into our jobs, which is a whole other weird phenomenon. And we try to just really focus on the more lighthearted things, you know, just kind of a place to put your AirPods in and breathe a little bit and not be quite so overwhelmed by the stuff that's going on in the day to day.
Love that. That's awesome.
We're very similar in that. In fact, one of our callers today for the show said, I just like to go here and know I'm going to laugh.
That's right.
So, yeah.
We underestimate how much we need it. And we have plenty of opportunities to experience frustration and the feeling of being overwhelmed. And I don't know that we give ourselves enough opportunities to laugh and appreciate one another and enjoy one another and kind of put all the things where we may disagree aside. So,
and you know what? Laughter is ministry. I don't know how many times people will call in and say, you know, my day started out wrong and I was not in a good mood. You guys made me laugh, and here I am back. So yeah.
I went to dinner with some friends last night, and it'd been a full day for everybody. And there was a point, and it was not even, I don't even know that it was anything that funny, but we started to laugh and we could not stop. And it was kind of like the more we laughed, the funnier it got.
The funnier it is.
Yeah. And listen, when I got in my car to come back home, my overall demeanor was completely different because I just had a chance to laugh a little bit. So we really love, Melanie and I both love that, you know, something as simple as talking about silly stuff can be entertaining to people.
Yeah, I agree. Well, hey, why don't we talk about what you came here for?
It's fine. I'll talk about whatever.
So you've written a book, A Fine Sight to See, Leading Because You Were Made for It. I love this is a beautiful cover here.
Thank you.
I love that. And as you could tell, this is directed towards women.
No. How could you tell? How could you tell?
I don't see a DeWalt drill in here.
That's right. Yeah. That's right.
So Christian women in leadership. Let's talk about that. But first of all, let's talk about the title. I think that's an interesting title for a leadership book. Where'd that come from?
So I wanted to write about leadership, particularly for women. I think it's a conversation that, in my experience, we we don't talk about it a lot. We don't talk about the topic of leadership a lot in relation to women in the church spaces, at least that I've been a part of. And I worked in vocational ministry for 21 years. I worked specifically with the girls in that ministry for the last 7. And so I wanted to write about leadership in an encouraging way, but I didn't know exactly how I was going to do it. So, but sort of running parallel to that was this sort of long running fascination I've had with Moses, which I know sounds strange because Moses has been very dead for a very long time, but I had this thing, like I just went back to his story again and again and again. So finally, one morning, this was a couple of years ago in January, I was going to see a friend in Houston, and I thought, I'm going to get on the plane and I'm going to read the book of Exodus front to back. And I just want to know, is there something here that I'm missing? Is there something? Why do I keep coming back to this? And I had also tried to start what turned out to be this book several times and just kept running into dead ends. And so I got on the plane. I was on a Southwest flight, and so I learned quickly that if you are on a Southwest flight while there is still open seating and you want the whole row, you just take your Bible, open to Exodus, get out a pen. You're all alone wherever you're going. You're all by yourself. But what
Man,
jumped
I'm
out?
going to do that now.
I'm telling you what, nobody's interested in the possibility. Right. I would even, if I was really determined to be by myself, I'd probably go Leviticus. But Exodus worked. It served its purpose. So, but here's what just started to jump out at me from the very beginning. And my Bible's not in here, but I would show you. I just started to notice over and over again various iterations of the word see, S-E-E. All connected to action, all connected to how we see one another, how we see God, how God sees us, how we see what God has done, but just see over and over and over and over. So I just started to circle it when I saw see, looked, sight, all that kind of stuff. And so by the time I got to Houston, I was sort of like, okay, I believe there's a connection here between the condition of our sight and the condition of our leadership. Because interestingly, the person in Exodus who only, who just almost never sees, really, I think sight is only mentioned of him one time, is Pharaoh, never sees. And so then the next morning I was like, okay, well, what about the end of Moses's life? And so I go to Deuteronomy, and what the end story of Moses's life tells us is that when he went up the mountain and God had said, it's time for you to die, it says that his vigor was unabated and his sight was unhindered. Now, I know physically, Moses was a spry fella for his age. I know, but that whole notion that we would be able to make it to the end of our lives with sight that is unhindered, that is unimpaired. I sat with that for a little bit. And so that's where the title comes from, because one, it's a fine sight to see when people are walking in the fullness of their gifts and have the freedom to use those gifts. That's a fine sight to see. It's kind of like we were talking about earlier with sports. And then I also think, just to kind of reiterate this notion that's all the way through the book of Exodus and also in the book of Deuteronomy, that the quality of our sight and how we see other people, and how we see ourselves in light of who God is, it matters so much. And so I didn't plan on it, but I ended up writing the book, like moving through the first 20 chapters of Exodus, which, by the way, is something I never planned on one time in my whole life, that I would write a book.
You didn't see that coming.
I did not see that coming.
I see what you did there.
Thank you so much. Listen, y'all just keep them coming. I'm all for the puns. But I never thought that I would write about that, particularly because I like to write things that are kind of funny. But it was just one of those really sweet intersections of a deep love that I have personally, which is leadership. And then just Scripture's ability to continue to teach us about so many things all these years later. And it's so applicable to where we live and love and serve right here and now. So it was the most fun to write. It really was.
You know, unfortunately, there's controversy of Christian women in leadership. And
Oh,
I didn't. I don't.
Oh, I have no idea what you're talking about.
I'm fortunate to be married to someone with who I would say she's a strong woman, and I love
Absolutely.
it.
Yeah.
And I will just say I'll credit her for changing my mind on a ton of different things. But I just, what would you say to the people that before they read it regarding that particular topic?
That's a whole thing, because I think I was if this gives you any indication of sort of where I come from. I was raised Methodist. My husband and I joined an Episcopal church when we first got married. I taught in a PCA, a Presbyterian school, for a long time. We were members of a Baptist church for a long time. Like, I feel like I have seen a lot of iterations of this particular topic in all kinds of different contexts. And that's why from the very beginning, when I started to write this book, and I really and truly believe if somebody's convictions are rooted and grounded in love, I'm not going to try to change them. Like, I don't want to get in an argument about it. I just want people to see that whatever the parameters they have around this topic within their personal faith spaces, if they feel the conviction that those are the right parameters for them, listen, you run with it. I'm not going to change your mind. I'm not trying to switch anybody over to how I see it, but I just want to remind women that a lot of the things that we do on the daily that we would diminish in some way by just saying it's just what we have to do. Those things are leadership. And so it's going to look different how that plays out in terms of kind of the expanse of the opportunities you might have to use your gifts. That's not my business. My concern is just that I would really love in our faith spaces if we would encourage women to use the gifts that they've been given, to use their voices for the good of the group and the glory of God. And if there are certain limitations on that, depending on a denomination, okay, that's not my thing to work out. But what I do know is that God greatly esteems women, that he has gifted everybody who loves him and trusts him with certain innate gifts and abilities. And so we want to be people who figure out how to use them and how to be faithful stewards of those gifts without minimizing them. You can walk in humility and also kill it with your gifts,
Ooh, that's an interesting angle. You said that. That's wow. That's a good point.
Yeah, you can.
Yeah.
Now, we would phrase it in the church. We would probably say, we want to prioritize excellence. We have all kinds of ways of sort of talking around these things. But the bottom line is, like, these gifts that you've been given are on purpose. So what you going to do with them? What you going to do with them?
You said there are core beliefs that are in this book. Talk about that. How'd you get them? Where do they come from?
I really honestly, just a long life of trying to suss some of this stuff out for myself, and trying to heal from some places where I've been hurt. And so God does greatly esteem women. And if you look at that first part of Exodus and the way he uses women to tee it up for what's coming with Moses, the way he gives, in particular, Jochebed, Moses' wife, the way he gives Miriam, Moses' sister, and Pharaoh's daughter, the way he aligned their sight and their vision to preserve Moses' life, it'll make you stop and think for a minute. So just this notion that God greatly esteems all women. All scripture is for our use and our benefit. So we don't look at certain stories of scripture and think, oh, well, that's a story about a guy. It's just for guys. Like, Moses' story is just as instructive for women as it is for men. And God loves us with an everlasting love. So those three things sort of informed, I feel like, the tone of the book, because I didn't want it to be alienating, and I didn't want women to come to this book and feel like they had to defend why they feel the way they feel about what their roles may or may not be. everybody gets to have their convictions. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was just really important for me to say, hey, if you want to know where I'm coming from, here's where I'm coming from. God loves you with an everlasting love. We have all of Scripture to teach us and encourage us and to shape us. And hopefully, just with that sort of laid out on the table, everybody knows that in the context of this particular conversation about leadership, they're safe. It's a welcome space for them.
Yeah. Wow. As you're talking about the women in Moses' life, like his mom and his sister and Pharaoh's daughter, I'll bet none of them recognized that they were leaders. They were 100%. Just living their life, right?
Right.
So this idea of how God sees you is so important and all about perspective. Yeah. So how does this help us change the way we, as Christian women, approach leadership opportunities? Because I think we're missing that we are leaders a lot of times.
Yeah, I think that there are three things, and I can't speak for all women. This has just been my experience. I think one, we kind of follow Moses' lead a little bit. And we tend to camp out in Midian more than we should. We disqualify ourselves because of maybe mistakes we've made, places where we have felt somehow shamed or whatever it is. Yeah. So we just sort of exile ourselves and think that we're not qualified. We also minimize the gifts that we've been given. We tend to think like, oh, everybody can do that. It's not that big a deal. I mean, listen, if you watch me in a room full of 2-year-olds in the nursery, you would understand that there are certain innate qualities that people who can do that have, and I do not share in those qualities. Like, it stresses me out. So we totally minimize the ways that we're gifted, and then we have a hard time sometimes stepping out with those things because we don't want anybody to think that we're being prideful. We don't want anybody to think that we think that we're better at this than other people. But because of all those things, which are all rooted to some degree in not wanting to get out ahead of God, I think, we end up holding back as opposed to really figuring out, what does it look like for me to use the gifts I've been given? For some of us, that's going to be in our careers. For some of us, that's going to be mainly in our homes. For some of us, that's going to be in our churches, in our communities. But I think we assume a lot of times before we ever get started that we're not the person to do that. Mm-hmm. And that's probably a whole separate conversation about why we do that. But I don't think a lot of times we feel as encouraged as maybe we could or should be encouraged in our local bodies. And I don't think that's malicious. I just think that's sort of how the system is built. And again, I'm not coming in to go toe to toe with anybody's elders situation. I think we get to think about it. I think we get to think about what's it look like for me to faithfully use the gifts I've been given, so that in the places where I have influence, I can call other people to higher and better, and I can glorify God in that process.
I love that. Now, you talked about, reading Exodus on the plane and noticing the leadership themes with the women in the book. But I think, for a book that focuses on male leadership, just the very concept that there would be ideas about female leadership in there is interesting. Talk about where that even started, where that started kind of percolating.
For me, it was a couple of places. It was one when Moses hightailed it to Midian because, he had killed a guy, which, not great. Not a great
decision.
Did
you just call him Mosey?
No, I meant to say Moses, but maybe he is. Maybe he is Mosey. I don't know.
He
moseyed.
Yes. When Moses went to Midian, I so related to that because there was a period in my own life where I was in ministry, but kind of wondering how I got there. And it was sort of like I lived in this ministry world by day and then went home to Midian at night. You know what I mean? Where I just really second guessed myself and just felt really sort of gross and ashamed by the decisions I made at different points when I was younger. So it was the Midian piece, and then Moses's persistent desire to let God know that he was really not the person for this job. I'm really not the one you want. I don't know. And I so related to that. Mm-hmm. And so then once you for me at least, once I found those places where I really related to Moses personally, his whole journey with the Israelites became infinitely more relatable on a lot of different levels, even down to when they've crossed the Red Sea. His father-in-law Jethro comes to visit because they're going to celebrate all the good things that God has done. And when Jethro gets an up-close look at how Moses is conducting the affairs with the Israelites, he goes to him and he says, hey, you can't keep doing this. Like, essentially, this is not sustainable for you. This is not sustainable for them. I think about all the times when I've sort of gotten over my own skis, and people have come to me and said, hey, like, we just, as a leader, Moses is all of us. As a person who's trying to trust God more and more, he is all of us. And so it was when I kind of made those personal connections, I went, oh yeah, Moses can teach women a lot. I mean, Moses has a lot to teach all of us about leadership. But women in particular, because I think that second guessing piece and that self-exiling piece is pretty relatable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. I remember doing a whole talk about oh no, not me, Lord, maybe you missed this part about I don't speak well. Maybe you missed this part.
That's right.
How harsh we can be on ourselves 100%. And missing the opportunities. So I love that.
And how merciful God is with us when our hearts really and truly are as humble as we can muster this side of heaven. And we really do want to be faithful in how we utilize whatever good gifts he has very graciously shared with us, and realizing that those gifts ultimately are his. So it's not just a matter of leadership, it's also a matter of stewardship, which kind of even resonates with me more, I think, at times than like this notion of leadership, even though I believe every believer is a leader. Maybe I have a little healthy fear of, I don't want to get to the end of my life and realize that I have in any way, shape, form, or fashion been stingy with what God has entrusted to me on any level,
Don't be stingy with your gift.
Yeah,
that's it.
Yeah.
Like, and I think we've so internalized that message with things like our financial stewardship. We've heard that so much. I don't know, and I'm speaking as a female here, I don't know if I have internalized that message as much when it comes to the gifts that aren't quite so tangible. And so, but it matters a lot. And I think the prophetic witness of the church matters a lot. The loving witness of the church matters a lot. And I think these are just the natural ways God has given us to participate in that.
That's good. Talk about seeing. What can we learn from seeing ourselves? What are we? Yeah. Help me see, Sophie.
Okay. Listen, I don't know if this is true for men. I feel like I'm pretty confident this is true for women. So I think it's really difficult because, again, we're not always built up in this way. But when I've had conversations with women, like, I don't even know what my gifts are. I don't even know what I like to do. Because I always say, think about what lights you up from the inside out. And I don't know, again, that's a way that we're sort of encouraged to think as kids. But I tend to say, if you want to see yourself clearly, apart from understanding how God sees you, which I would say go to the Psalms. But
yeah, good point.
But in terms of seeing like how you are created to love and serve and lead, I think we can look back at our childhoods and see the things that we love to do even then. I think that we can think about, like, right now, if we had sort of unlimited time, what is something that we could do where it would feel like time was just a vapor? You know, there's certain things that we can participate in, and we're like, oh my gosh, that flew by. That I can't believe that I spent 4 hours doing that thing. It's because we deeply love that thing. We enjoy that thing. So I think it's good for us to think about that in terms of seeing ourselves clearly. And I don't think it's a bad thing, even though it's vulnerable and it can be uncomfortable, to ask the people who love us, hey, what do you see here? Is there anything that jumps out at you in terms of how I'm sort of naturally wired to do certain things? Now, it's vulnerable, right? But the people who love you are going to come through. Like, they're going to say something to affirm you. You got to be real safe to ask that question. But I think sometimes it's a matter of seeing the thread that God has sort of pulled through our whole lives that maybe we've taken for granted a little bit. Like, one of my things my whole life, I like to understand people. I don't know how you put that in like a quippy adjective, but I really like to understand people. And that's been true my whole life. I'm a question asker, and I've never connected that in any way, shape, form, or fashion with leadership until I wrote this book. But I thought, I think it's a way that I can empathize with people. Like, I can be more compassionate if I understand people. And so even little things like that, I think, are important to recognize about ourselves. Not like, ooh, I'm awesome, I'm a great question asker. But, oh, God has given me a natural curiosity about people. How could I use that in some way to encourage those people and to glorify Him? And then it becomes kind of fun, you know?
You know, I think, wow, I'll just say this, you're going to be a great leader already. I'll tell you that, because I think if you're a leader that understands people,
yes,
then you're leading from the right position.
Yes.
And there's going to be some empathy there. You're not just going to blow everybody over.
That's it.
Yeah, that's great. That's
awesome. 100% true. And I think just having worked with teenagers for so long in the context of being an English teacher, and then working with the girls
them at all, though.
and working with the girls at school, one thing that's so interesting to me about our Gen Z friends, and I love our Gen Z friends because they are courageous in ways that I never knew I could be. But what's so interesting to me is that, you know, when I was growing up, if I was in a situation, like I was in a room and there was a clear leader at the front of the room, that person had my respect because they were the leader at the front of the room. That is not the case with our younger friends. You can stand at the front of the room all you want to, but if you do not demonstrate to them that you are sincerely invested in the outcome of whatever you're talking about as it pertains to them, they're not going to listen. And so, and so that helped me to see like this propensity for being a question asker in kind of a different light. I was like, oh, it enables me to connect with people in a different way than just sitting down and telling people what I think. But I think we all have those things inside us that enable us to connect. But we're quick to dismiss them and just think, that's no big deal. That's no big deal. That's no big deal. For some people, it's an ability to dial something down to in a really understandable way, to take something really complex and make it super understandable. For some people, it's listening. I'm going to tell you one thing. This book left me with such an appreciation for people who have quiet leadership, who don't have to be heard all the time, but don't miss a thing in terms of the places they work or within their family system or whatever it happens to be. Just incredibly discerning because they pay attention. So I think there are 1,000 things like that where our instinct might be to go, oh, whatever. But golly, they make us more compassionate. They make us more empathetic image bearers who care for other image bearers in a more loving way. So that's sort of a tangent, but
you talked about Moses in exile in Midian and your own personal Midian experience. Maybe somebody's listening right now and feel like I'm in exile.
Yeah,
I'm in the dry wasteland right now. Talk about that, your personal experience as it applies to Moses as well.
Yeah, it's been so interesting just going to different book events. And I feel like at every single one, there's been a woman who came up to me and said, I think I'm a Midian. When I recorded the audiobook for this, when I got through that section, my producer, when I walked out of the little recording booth, she looked at me and she said, I think I'm a Midian. And, and my reaction to that is, do not despise a Midian. Because God clarifies some things in our Midians, and he repairs and restores some things that need to be repaired and restored. One thing that strikes me about Moses' Midian in particular is that he didn't walk through it alone. As soon as he gets to Midian, he sits down and Jethro's daughters see him, and he kind of gets welcomed into that fold. And so I would say in our Midians, it's really important that we're surrounded by family. Now, that doesn't mean the family necessarily we were born into, but I think that at our former church, they would have said our faith family. But just the people that we trust, just the family that we've made. I just think it's important for people to be looped into that process. Hey, I'm going through something where I'm feeling really ashamed. Hey, I'm going through something where I'm really questioning some things.
So pipe up and say something.
Pipe up and say something. Like, don't let the Midian go unspoken. But it's so tricky because the reason you're there is probably because you're ashamed about something. So who wants to pipe up and say, hey, I'm ashamed about something? But I think that and Moses was there for 40 years. Lord have mercy. I mean, we don't want to be there that long. But I think what I realized is when I finally started talking about it, and it took me a long time, but when I finally started opening up about how I felt, it did a couple of things. One, it helped to be a little bit of a release valve on some of that shame. And it gave me the gift of other people's perspective, right? Which is essentially people being able to look at you and say, me too. Same. You know, like, I get it. And it's essentially a space. It's hard to sit there, but it's also a place where likely, I believe, if we're wise and we're faithful in that process, we're going to find more often than not, I think, that we're going to be loved back to life a little bit, not just by people, but also by God. And we'll have a clearer perspective on the other side of how God can use it. And somebody messaged me not too long ago and said, essentially that, yes, Midian was a rough spot for Moses, but it was where God repaired his sight, and because the whole reason why he killed the Hebrew man, he went outside, he saw the Hebrew and while he killed the Egyptian man, he went outside, he saw the Hebrew and the Egyptian fighting, and he did not use his sight redemptively. He used it instead to justify his hatred and his anger. And so I think we see the effects of the repair work that God does when Moses responds to God's call and begins to walk with the Israelites. There's good stuff that happens there.
As you're talking and I'm thinking of the word perspective, that's a huge word. And thinking about the women in Moses' life that we ID'd a little bit ago, but maybe you can expound a little bit, because I believe probably in their perspective, they didn't know.
Yeah.
They couldn't see, using your word, the impact that they were actually happening. And I'm listening to you and thinking, wow, we could be thinking we're in our own Midian, and yet God is using us in a way that we're just not seeing. Our perspective is off.
Yeah, it's so true. I think about Jochebed, his mom, and this really all started even with Shiphrah and Puah even earlier, who defied Pharaoh's ruling to kill the male babies.
Can I pause and say these names are awesome, by the way?
I know, everybody needs to file them away. Especially if you're expecting,
this
you
is
never
my
know.
Baby Jochebed.
That's right. But like Shiphrah and Puah were midwives who, when Pharaoh issued the initial decree, like, hey, all the male babies have to die.
Yeah.
They were like, oh, no, see, the Hebrew women are hardy, and they're having these babies before we can even get to them. So I think my thing with Jochebed is like just the courage that it took for her to see. It says right away that she saw that he was a fine baby. Like immediately she sees he's a fine baby. And then when she decides that she's going to hide him, and then realizes that she has to release him into the Nile, the way, it's like it would be the greatest movie scene to watch Jochebed release Moses into the Nile, and then Miriam watching Moses, Miriam seeing Pharaoh's daughter come down there to bathe, Miriam seeing Pharaoh's daughter see Moses, Pharaoh's daughter sending somebody to get Moses, Miriam seeing that, like all this scene going back and forth between these three women as they cooperate to find a way for Moses to be returned to his mom and be raised in his actual home before Pharaoh's daughter adopts him when he is older. I don't know that any of those women would have said in that situation, hey, I'm such a leader, I'm a leader.
Right.
I don't know that any of us, even sometimes in the context of raising our own children, look at ourselves and say, hey, I'm a leader. And so but when you see like just take Jochebed, when you see how her actions, her sight affected not just Moses, but the nation of Israel as a result, like we gotta be, on some level, be able to recognize this matters. It may not matter on the scale that it mattered for Jochebed. It may not matter on the scale that it mattered for the Israelites, but we just have no idea how our leadership can ripple and how it can affect change for good. And so I think, if you look at the span of time between Jochebed seeing Moses was a fine baby, and then even the moment where Moses leads the Israelites across the Red Sea, you have to think, that's a good call, Jochebed. That's a good call. Well done with that. And so, I don't know, I think it's such an encouragement to just remember that when our sight is rooted and grounded in love, and when we act on what we see based on compassion and an understanding of who God is and how much he loves his children, listen, I don't see any negative in that. I don't see any negative consequence of that at all.
Well, okay, so let's go back to we talked earlier about, being able to, the practical steps to identify your giftings. I think there is a challenge, however, with embracing the ways that you can be a leader, the gifts that you have. And it's getting better. I think most women have faced this at some point or another, especially in the workforce, where you're kind of like, you need to temper down. You need to be small.
Let's talk about that for a second. The number of women.
Way to put your finger on it, Misty.
I know. The number of women who have come up to me at book events with tears in their eyes and said, I have always believed I was too much. I have always been told that I was too much. That's all.
Yeah. No, it's true. I have been in the past, I mean, this is a while back, but in professional situations where it was all but verbalized to me, you don't want to outshine the men here.
Yeah, 100%.
Get down. And it's hard to, I think when that's ingrained in you over a certain period of time, it's hard to really step into the places that you're being called to leadership because you've been you've been restrained for so long. That's about that.
So, yes. Yes. Just say that. Yes. It's a whole thing. It's a whole thing. And it's so hard to talk about because a lot of times the people who need to hear that the most are not listening, right? We also sometimes are trying to operate in systems that are not teed up for women. Now, listen, I am a full believer that we also need to esteem, value, promote, cherish the gifts of men. Absolutely. For me, this is a both and, not an either or, right? But I think it takes several things. And I think it's going to, as all things do, it's going to look different for different people. I think you cannot underestimate the impact of a single compassionate man who is willing to listen in some of these male-dominated systems, right? I had a boss the last 7 years I was at school. He's one of the best leaders I have ever known in my life. Being able to work with him was such a joy. But I'll tell you, he's one of the safest places for me to voice some of these frustrations. He's the brother of 3 sisters. He's the son of a really strong mom. And he listened. He didn't just, he heard me. He listened to me. He saw me, all the things. That was really a life-giving situation for me, particularly when things were kind of hard for me in the place where I worked that last little stretch. So there's that. That's a really good place to start, I think, some of these conversations that we need to have. But there's also this thing, and this is the part that I don't have any idea how to fix. I think sometimes when we're in those spaces, our perception is that we have to stay there, that we are bound to those spaces, that we cannot survive outside of those spaces, that we will be unfaithful if we leave those spaces. I was wrestling with all of this several years ago, and a friend of mine, I was talking about it a little bit, and she just looked at me and she said, "What would it take for you to have peace?" And I said, "Oh, I have to leave."
Wow. Yeah.
And it was so clear when she asked the question. I didn't want to leave, but you have to leave. Now, leaving is not always practical. Even when I told my husband, I got to leave, he was like, okay, we need an exit strategy, right? So it requires a strategy. But I think just to say, hey, sometimes if it's a lot on you, if it is taxing to you spiritually, emotionally, mentally, it's okay sometimes to go, I don't belong here, and I get to leave. It may require a strategy. It may take some time, because a lot of times we think, well, I'm going to sit here and I'm going to affect more change from the inside out. But sometimes there are practices in place. There are belief systems in place that are such steel walls, like you could not blow them out with a stick of dynamite. And so I think we have to think about, as women and as men, what is healthy for me here? What is there something about here that is hindering the health of even my relationship with the Lord, my relationship with the body of believers, my relationship in terms of my freedom to exercise my gifts? Sometimes we have to leave, and it stinks, and it's heartbreaking, but sometimes that's just what it is. And not always, but sometimes I think that's what we have to do. Sorry.
You know, it's unfortunate.
No,
yeah.
But I mean, well, let's go to a sports analogy. Ready for this?
Okay. Yeah. Right.
So, Sophie, I know you love sports, but
yes,
there's a particular quarterback who has finally found a team where that team has embraced him, and I'm talking about Baker Mayfield, who's now playing for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who was kind of going traveling. He was an exile, we'll just say that.
100%.
Yeah, and then now he's got a team that believes in him. And he's flourishing.
And I would also say Baker Mayfield told time and time again that he was too much, right?
Right.
Like I feel like, I mean, especially like in his younger years, I feel like the narrative about him was he was too much. He needed to dial it down. He needed to dial it back, like all this kind of stuff. But he just needed to get to the place, like you said, where he was surrounded by people who appreciated the gifts, where his gifts were a fit for that organization. Right. Yeah. It's so, you love to see it, right? When it happens, you love to see it.
But yes, it's unfortunate. Yeah, that sometimes you got to go. Yeah. And that's not, shouldn't be that way, but you know, unfortunate.
Yeah. But I think ultimately, you know, I don't know. I always think about the fact that we confuse power and leadership so much, right? And so we feel like sometimes we have to stay somewhere and we have to fight to have power. We have to fight to have a voice. We have to fight to have any kind of control at all. But if we look at scripture, what Moses was actually about, he was not about power. He was about deliverance. So what does deliverance look like, right? Where do we have the most opportunities for deliverance in terms of our impact on other people? And we're not going to have time for deliverance if we're forever beating our heads against a wall, right? So right. I think if we can connect the ways we're gifted to what freedom looks like for us, then we're going to have more opportunities to affect freedom in other people's lives too. Like it's hard to lead people in the direction of freedom when you feel like you're a little bound up yourself. So,
that's a good point.
I don't know.
Wow. Very good point.
Yeah.
How can men, male leaders, sorry, you can't. Yeah. There's no way around it. No, I'm just saying, how can men in leadership, I would just say this, esteem women's voices and empower them in, and I think that a lot of this has to do with culture. A lot of it has to do with how you were raised.
Absolutely.
Unfortunately, I was not raised with any kind of thought that women were less than men. And I'm so glad my wife didn't come from that. Well, she was two sisters in a family, no boys there, but her dad was like, there's a dog.
Mine too, by the way. Mine too.
Mm-hmm. But you know what? How can not that we can, you said it earlier. I don't know if we can change a man's opinion here.
Right.
Maybe we can. I don't know. How can we do that?
Yeah. I think I would never want any man to read this book and think, so I'm sorry about the dog, and think, hey, you gotta get after it, sir. Like this is on you. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just saying about how do we create environments where women have freedom to exercise their God-given gifts in ways that are good for the group. So I think one thing is to consider what questions they have not asked. To consider whether they have created a culture in the environments, and whether it's in an office or a church or wherever, where it's a little bit of a boys' club, and what the guys say is, kind of how it goes, and where women don't feel heard. One thing that I have noticed in faith spaces, and again, this is going to differ in denomination. I'm not pointing fingers at everybody. But I've just noticed in my own life, I had this realization one morning where I was like, I don't ever hear women's voices in a worship service. Never. I'll never hear a woman's voice. I'm not talking about like a woman getting up and preaching, although I would be fine with that too. Not everybody in every denomination would be okay with that, and that's fine too. But like, could I hear a woman pray? Could I hear just a woman's voice? And I think sometimes we don't realize how much we have shut out those voices until we step back and go, oh. So I think it starts with conversation, and I think it starts with a determination to not be defensive and to not, I'm so sorry, y'all. Hazel is really battling with a delivery that's happening here. And there's not one thing.
Let me just tell you that these sweet people, these sweet people here, I've got 3 dogs behind me.
Okay.
So so they are very kind and considerate, and you're good.
Thank you. So
Bring
I don't
your dog
know.
on the air. It's totally fine.
Okay. So I think just a willingness to go, hey, let me hear about how this affects you. Not let me fix how this affects you.
Yes.
Not let me give you 3 points about why this shouldn't affect you, but let me hear about how this affects you. I worked with my friend Brian for several years at school. Brian's younger than I am. He's now at a school outside of Atlanta, and I mean, God bless him. We worked together a lot, and he just kind of had a front row seat for a lot of my perspective where all this is concerned as I was working through some of it. And what I will say that Brian did, and we're still good friends to this day, one of the things that Brian did is he would come in my office and he would sit in my chair and he would say, tell me how you feel. Tell me how you're feeling. And he would let me say it, and he would let me feel it. And then he might come back a couple of weeks later and say, you know what, I was thinking about what you said. And I'm wondering if, maybe we could talk about this thing, or maybe maybe have you thought about this thing? And we could start to kind of break it down. But he was always so willing to let me express how certain practices and policies made me feel. That was such a gift. That's half the battle, is feeling like you've got a place to say it. And again, I would never want to belittle or certainly not vilify male leadership in any way. It's so important. It's so important. It's so important. So is female leadership. It's so important. It's so important. It's so important. So I think a willingness to listen to one another, to refuse to be defensive, and to resist the urge to fix it, I think is a really good place to start.
Oh, well, men want to fix everything.
I know my husband, even sometimes when we sit down and I'm going to tell him something, he'll say, is this a thing? Do you want me to tell you how I think you could fix it, or you just want me to listen? And I'll say, I just want you to listen. He'll go, got it.
I'll just say this. My relationship with my wife has improved dramatically when I just listen.
Yes.
Don't try to fix anything, because she doesn't want me to. She just wants to talk.
Right.
She needs to process it. And
you know, I've noticed this, and I don't want to interrupt real quick, but I've noticed this. When I hear her talking the other way, or I hear two women talking to each other, they don't fix each other either. They're just listening.
Yeah. Just being able to say,
or they'll say something empathetic. Like,
yes.
Oh, very empathetic.
I bet that really hurts.
I'm so sorry. How about that?
Yes, the way they talk to is full of empathy, and men just aren't quite wired like that. And we could learn to do that, I think.
Awesome. Yeah, I think so. And listen, if the power dynamics were not skewed the way they're skewed, we might be sitting here talking about, like, listen, how can we fix things better for you? Like, how can we participate in laying out a process? But I think for whatever reason at this current, point in time, more often than not, particularly inside evangelical spaces, what we're going to find is women who don't feel heard. And so they feel loved, I think, for the most part, but they don't necessarily feel heard. And it's really hard to figure out how you can utilize your leadership and your voice when you feel like nobody's listening to you, and when you feel like your voice doesn't matter, and when you feel like your voice cannot possibly affect any kind of change that's meaningful. So it can be really disheartening. And I think that's hard sometimes for men to appreciate, because it's not where they live, right? It's not their daily experience. And as women, what we learn to do is we learn to mash it down. And I used to tell Sean, my boss, all the time, okay, I'll go in there and I'll be winsomely deferential, because that's my job. But you have never had to be winsomely deferential, not one time in your whole life ever. And we train ourselves to be winsomely deferential, and we are seething inside. We're so angry. We're so angry. We're so angry.
Wow. Yeah. Yep.
So that's just a little light thought for y'all this morning. Listen, y'all, just everybody be blessed. And it's just a breezy concept.
I watched the Barbie movie with my wife. Have you seen it?
Yes. Get back in the box, Barbie. Just get back in the box.
Get back in the box.
There were points in that movie that were a little stingy for me, but I will just say this, that I think it opens your mind to a world you're not experiencing. I'm just speaking as a man.
Yes.
To a world that you're not experiencing, and I thought it was fantastic, personally.
I did too.
Some people are like, oh, it's awful. That was demeaning towards men. I didn't really take it that way at all. It was really sort of like, in other words, it helped you empathize, like maybe you're a different ethnicity, or what would it be like to be a minority? And I think it was a eye opener for her. I think men should watch it.
I agree. My husband went with two of his best friends, and I don't know that any of them were super excited to go initially. But they all walked away going, that was incredible. Because here's what happens. One, if you're raising daughters, you appreciate the message. Two, it really gets to, I think, so beautifully and so creatively to the idea that the extremes are not helpful to us in these situations. We don't want it to skew all one way to the men. We don't want it to skew all one way to the women. It's somewhere in this gracious middle where we're called as brothers and sisters in Christ to love one another and support one another and esteem one another. What does that look like? And, but I think that visual, I've thought about it 1,000 times, of when Barbie goes into the boardroom that is made up only of men. Yep. And tries to ask for what she needs. And they're like, hey, Barbie, just get back in the box. Just get back in the box. And so she kind of starts scooting back, headed toward the box. And it's only when those little plastic wristbands start to fasten over her wrist that she's like, oh, no, I can't do that. And she gets out of there, and they can't catch her either. But I think it is such a great way to sort of bring home some of these things that we've been talking about today. And it's funny and it's silly and it is occasionally a little unbalanced in terms of how it communicates what men are doing. But by and large, I think it's helpful. I think it's really helpful.
I agree. Wow. Good book.
Yeah.
A fine sight to see, leading because you were made for it. Thank you, Sophie. Sophie Hudson. And if people want to find out more about you, how can they do that?
Probably just Instagram's the best bet. I'm Boo Mama 205 because Boo Mama was taken the day I signed up on Instagram, and so I had to add my area code. But probably there. I still have a website at boomama.net, but that's really just for podcast stuff. So, but I'm frequently on the Instagram.
Amen. Well, thank you for sharing. This is awesome.
Hey, thank y'all so
stuff.
much. Thank y'all for such really such an open conversation. I appreciate it so much. I think it's so good to talk about these things and to realize we don't have to be threatened by just maybe acknowledging what other people that we love and that we care for in the body are dealing with. So thanks.
Amen.
Thank you.
I agree.
Bless you. We have a new best friend. Thank you.